Webinar started, and here we go. Pushed on the record button, so now we're official. Welcome. Today we're going to talk about Standard 2, and there are some new things to share with you, and I'm glad that you made the decision and the commitment to attend. I have muted everyone, but I will unmute you when it comes to the question and feedback portions. I have those embedded throughout the presentation, so those of you that are frequent flyers know how this works. Okay, today we're going to talk about all PPPs, EPPs, addressing CAEP standards. So if you're addressing NCATE standards or you're still addressing TAC quality principles, not much of what I'm going to tell you is going to be relevant in the immediate future, but on the long term it certainly will be until new guidelines come out. All right, let's go to the next slide. This is pretty basic. Those of you, again, that are frequent flyers, you know to mute your phones, but I've got control of your phones right now and they're all muted. Remember to unmute when you want to talk, and I will unmute those phones when I come to a feedback and question pause in case anyone wants to speak up. You're free to ask a question during the chat. Just type your question into the chat. I did send you all a message. I hope you got it. It sounds like somebody who's on the line has got a big crew with them. I don't know, maybe you're at happy hour somewhere and observing my webinar, in which case that's a good idea. The recording of the webinar will be posted on YouTube by March 1st. The recording as well as the PowerPoint. You'll be able to download them both off of YouTube. I find that mildly embarrassing that I am officially on YouTube, but nonetheless, what can I say? Okay, today our goals and objectives are not unlike the goals and objectives that are appeared for any standard that I presented on. I'm going to take a deep dive into Standard 2 and its components. And by the conclusion of this, I really hope you can point out the key points in Standard 2 as well as its components. That you can identify the kinds of evidence that CAEP is going to recommend, or yes, they are recommendations that CAEP is recommending for each of the components. And that you'll have a good sense and be able to describe how those standards and components are going to be evaluated by CAEP reviewers. And so if you've been a party to my Standard 2 presentation before, what you've got today are some updated information. There's a new accreditation handbook coming out in March. And so I've included some of those new elements. In addition to that, I've included what constitutes an AFI or a stipulation under each component and for the standard as a whole. So I hope that's useful to you, and we'll get to that in just a minute. I always start with the key points in the language of the standard itself. And the reason I do that is because this is what you need to speak to. Unlike the if you were with the NCATE process in the past, you kind of spoke to all of the components as a part of your narrative on a given standard. And CAEP is discouraging that. They really don't want you to revisit the evidence that you've uploaded for the components. You only speak to the standard itself. And they'll ask for a holistic summary of what the evidence that you've uploaded has told you about your capacity to meet the standard. And so I always start with looking at the language of the standard itself. And I staffed the committee that wrote this standard, and so I'm very comfortable talking about the thoughts behind some of the directives here. So feel free to ask me. First of all, in the language of the standards, it's talking about effective partnerships and high-quality clinical practice. It is not by accident that this standard reads with partnerships appearing as the first word. That was a very intentional decision on the part of the committee. And that these effective partnerships and high-quality practices establish the foundation under which candidates can develop their knowledge, skills, and professional dispositions. And just like many other of the CAEP standards that you will read, What we really want candidates to be able to do is to demonstrate their positive impact on all P12 students' learning. So each of the components delves into some particular piece of the language of the standards. And as you know, the components are where you will upload your evidence if you are a selected improvement or transformation initiative pathway person. If you are an inquiry brief person, you're going to be uploading, well, not uploading so much as including your evidence for each one of these components as a part of your inquiry brief. So let's take a peek at these. 2.1 is really about effective partnerships, and I've highlighted that because it's a language straight out of the standard itself. So you will have to speak to the effectiveness of your partnerships and what the evidence is that you've unloaded, what it tells you about the effectiveness of your partnerships. You'll talk about high quality clinical practice. That's the second piece, which is all about clinical educators that are effective. And then lastly, the clinical experiences. And in the past, we've always thought, and there was a question addressed to the committee, why weren't partnerships first with the other elements of clinical educators and partnerships last? Why weren't clinical experiences, clinical practice, listed first? And it was very intentional on part of the committee because they believed that if your partnerships are in place and you have high quality clinical practice, then the clinical experiences can also be high quality, provided that what you're doing is developing a sequential and coherent set of experiences over time. So we're going to delve into each of those, but first, any questions, comments up to this point, and I will unmute you all to see if anybody'd like to speak up. Right now, I don't think there's anything in the chat. There isn't. Okay. Anybody have a question? Okay. Hearing nobody jumping to the gun, I'm going to move forward. Let's look at component 2.1. This is key language of that component, and it's all about partners and co-construction and mutually beneficial and shared responsibility for continuous improvement and mutually agreeable expectations that theory and practice are linked, that there's a coherence across clinical and academic components, and there's a shared accountability for candidate outcomes. This theme of coherence and linking theory and practice will reappear again and again as you see the evidence that CAEP is looking for. So basically, I want you to think about what evidence do you have that would demonstrate that your partnerships are mutually beneficial, mutually accountable, and that your decision-making is shared. That's the key here. You're demonstrating the mutuality and the benefit of partnerships. So possible types of evidence are memorandum of understanding or agreement, MOUs or MOAs, providing what are the common expectations for all candidates and evidence that you've developed those with your partners. Can you provide a history of collaboratively designed observation or evaluation tools? Can you provide sections from your field experience and clinical practice handbooks? You don't want to include the whole handbook. I know that was common practice in the past, but what you want to be thinking about is where do I want the reviewers to have their attention specific to this component? And cut and paste the pieces of the handbook that talk about mutual expectations or talk about, what your agreements are with your partners. You could also provide a schedule of joint meetings between partners and the purpose and topics covered in those meetings. Topics perhaps demonstrating review of observation or evaluation tools, review of the common expectations. And lastly, and this is not certainly an exhaustive list of the possible types of evidence that you might provide, but to date, this is some of the thinking about what might be provided. So how is your coursework aligned with field experiences? And how does that alignment of coursework and field experience provide opportunities for candidates to observe and implement effective teaching strategies linked to the coursework? What CAEP is really trying to do here is to take to heart the report of the Blue Ribbon Panel that talked about the need for some coherence between the academic portions of our preparation of candidates and the school-based portions. And as you are probably well aware, it's a pretty common thing out there that field experience and academic coursework have often been at odds with each other. It was quite common for our candidates to go out in the field and have the schools tell them, hey, look, whatever it is they taught you over there, that's fine, but here's the way we do it. And so CAEP was looking to see that there's some alignment, some conversation, and some input from your school partners that would lead to your candidates not having so much of that disconnect in terms of their academic coursework and their practical applications. So what's the evidence for 2.1 that site visitors would look for? Well, documentation the partnerships being implemented as you described. There are MOUs or MOAs, and there are MOUs and MOAs. There's a difference between what the Memorandum of Understanding or Agreement lays out and what it is that's actually done in practice. And so they're looking for documentation that partnership is being implemented as you describe it, whether you excerpt it from a field experience handbook or include the MOU as part of your evidence. A new piece, and this is inserted here, is that input is regularly sought. When CAEP reviewers are going around looking at your evidence and in the offsite and looking at your evidence on site, they're going to look to see for sure that input has been sought from your partners. Now that may be through interviews, it may be through an examination of documents, but they're looking for the fact that the partners are actively included in decision making. So that's what the two underbullets point out, that you collaborate in decision making, and it includes technology-based collaborations. And what that means is that perhaps you have partners that are so far-flung across the state or across the nation, perhaps, if you are a predominantly technology-based preparation program, it could be that your partners are far-flung. And so including them, not having just those on-site meetings, but also having opportunities for people who are not able to attend a person-to-person gathering, but can attend virtually, is encouraged by CAEP and accepted. And evidence that your placements, instruments, evaluation have been co-constructed with your partners, that they've had input into those instruments. And this, if you provide evidence in 2.1 of the fact that your partners have been involved in the observational instruments and evaluations, you can cross-tab that to component 5.6 that talks about the involvement of stakeholders in your quality assurance system. So that's a good point to keep in mind, is that some of the evidence that you're providing for any one of the components can be cross-tagged to other components to which they're applicable. So the other thing site visitors are going to be looking for is evidence that these partnerships are in place, that they're reviewed annually, and that they include the following things. This piece here about being reviewed annually, and I'm going to see if my cursor can come up here. Yes, it can. Is a new piece that's going to be in the CAEP accreditation manual. Okay, so that you understand that your school partnerships don't just sort of languish out there on the borders of occasional advisory meetings 2 times a year, but that you're actually evaluating the effectiveness of those partnerships. Are they providing the kinds of placements of clinical educators that are really contributing to your candidates' effectiveness as beginning teachers? Is it a high quality partnership? And so that is something that you should think about. as you construct your assessment system is how you're going, or your quality assurance system, as Standard 5 calls it. How are you evaluating your partnerships? In what ways and how often? At least it should be on an annual basis. So what are the effective school district partnerships? People are asking that all the time. Well, what does effectiveness mean if those are effective partnerships? Well, you have significant shared responsibility. It's not just a flyby opportunity where you pick up the phone, or your field experience coordinator picks up the phone, calls up the school, says, hey, listen, I've got a few student teachers. How many can you take? Okay, that there are more significant shared responsibilities besides that. That there are common expectations for candidates, and that descriptive feedback is provided. And this is a new piece that I've inserted here. It comes out of the CAEP accreditation manual. And it says that descriptive feedback is provided so that your cooperating teachers, your mentors, your clinical educators that are site-based educators, school-based educators, are providing substantive feedback to your candidates. And that there's common expectations. That this isn't just she did such a great job putting up my bulletin board, but there are really, the expectation is that your candidates are going to be able to do substantive things doing their field experiences and during their clinical practice, and that there is substantial, significant feedback that is given to candidates as they prepare to be beginning teachers. And lastly, I said this would appear again and again, is the coherence across clinical and academic aspects of preparation. Looking for collaboration here, where there isn't that divide between, what they told you over there and what they're telling you now. In our schools are different. Forget what they told you. Just pay attention to us. Okay, I'm going to hold that. I do see a question. Questions have popped up in the chat room, and I'm going to finish up on 2.1, and then I'll review all those questions. Evidence for 2.1. What else are CAEP site visitors going to look for? Well, one thing to keep in mind is if you're putting evidence into 2.1, make sure it only applies to 2.1. So 2.1 is all about partnerships, okay? And as we said, that you could have documents, that show the topics and the discussions that are occurring in your partner meetings. And so here we've got an excerpt from a partner meeting on 9/22/2014, okay? And these are and it gives the reference page 4 in the minutes, okay? And that it's relevant to CAEP standard 2.1. Okay, so we're being very explicit here on the upload of evidence. These are the minutes, blah, 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 blah. And people will know exactly, your reviewers will know exactly that if they go in to the minutes of 2014 on page 4, they should see this, that you didn't invent it. I'm saying that. That's not CAEP saying that. So mentor teachers from these various schools met with clinical supervisors and revised the clinical observation instrument. Okay, so revisions, this is getting to the point that your assessments and your instruments have the input of your partners. And this could be cross-tagged, as I mentioned before, not only with component 2.1, but when you upload this, cross-tag it to the partnership stakeholder component in Standard 5. Now this too is new right here, where it says evidence can be descriptive with verification occurring on site. And so just remember that you can be uploading not so much data per se, but a descriptive account of how your partnerships work, how you're describing those partnerships, how the meetings occur, etc., etc. And then what the site visitors will do is verify those statements when they're on site. So I want to tell you this is a new piece too. AFIs are stipulations. I don't know how familiar people are with the difference. Areas for improvement are AFIs, and those come from NCAEP World, in which certain weaknesses were identified. Weaknesses were what the what our TAC colleagues are familiar with. Okay, so in NCAEP World, there were only AFIs. But in TAC world, there were weaknesses and stipulations. Stipulations being AFIs of such, let me say, weight or strength that they were substantive. They needed to be fixed in 2 years or less. AFIs, as you know, areas for improvement or weaknesses, can be something that you fix over time, over the course of 7 years until you get your next accreditation visit. Stipulations are really Fisher-cut bait weaknesses or areas for improvement. They're the ones that say, you got to fix this and you got to fix it now. So a stipulation could be assigned based on the evidence you provided in component 2.1. because there is no convincing evidence that partnerships effectively share. That they share their decision making, that they share coherence. Remember, I said that was going to appear again and again across clinical and academic components, and that they share accountability for the results. So this is important to keep in mind. A stipulation is a significant weakness or area for improvement. And a number of stipulations or a particularly severe stipulation can lead to a failed standard, and we'll visit that at the end. Okay, I believe the next slide is the feedback or question pause, and I'm going to yank over this little window here so that I can read the chat, and I do see a question up here. Yes, only one, and thank you for the questions. I love questions, otherwise I end up just talking to myself. When looking at the CAEP standards holistically, Standard 2 appears to be the best starting point before EPP assessment development, placement protocols, and the rest. Is this a key message? Oh my goodness. Thank you. Next question. That's a joke. You know, that's a really good point about the effectiveness of partnerships, and I do think it's a key point. But I think the key message of CAEP is that what matters most to CAEP at this point is how have your candidates performed as beginning teachers. So if your partnerships are at the heart of clinical preparation, and honestly, that was some language that was in the standard originally, that clinical partnerships, that partnerships are the heart and soul of teacher preparation, but it was removed. It would indicate that, yes, spend some time on your clinical practice, because Standard 1, Standard 2 in Component 2.3, and Standard 3 in Component 3.5 all talk about the sequential, purposeful, coherent, monitored, assessed development of candidates' knowledge and skills through field experience and clinical practice. So, Jerry, I think it's a dual message, not a mixed message, but a dual message. Yes, partnerships, particularly when you look at it as a developmental sequence of field experience culminating in clinical practice, are key and can and should prepare candidates to be the kind of beginning teachers that have a positive impact on P12 student learning and development. So thank you for that question, and I hope I answered it. I'm going to unmute everybody, see if anyone wants to speak up. Any other questions? Comments? Applause? Boos? Okay, folks, you're going on unmute again. Going on mute. Here we go. We're going to go to the next slide. We're going to dig into component 2.2. Kind of finished with the partnership piece. Now component 2.2 is all about your clinical educators. And the original intention of the committee here was that clinical educators meant absolutely anybody who touched a teacher candidate. And there was a lot of pushback on that, and so CAEP dialed back. And what we've got right now are clinical educators refer to anybody who is supervising, either from the university or from the schools, candidates during field experiences or clinical practice. And you'll notice that that there is a chart that you need to complete that's all about the qualifications of the people who supervise your candidates in terms of recency of experience. So here we go. What does the component state? The component says, and it's not unlike the partnership component, that you co-select, co-prepare, co-evaluate, co-support, co-retain high-quality clinical educators. So the co appears under co-select, but it was intended to be across the board, that there is mutuality in decision-making here. That underscores the importance of the mutuality and the benefit in component 2.1. So here you go. So you've got clinical educators that are selected. The criteria for their selection and everything else is collaboratively determined. And that these are clinical educators themselves who demonstrate they have a positive impact, not only on P12 learning, but they've got a positive impact on your candidate's development. And the rest of the component goes on to describe that, together with partners, you've got technology-based applications to establish, maintain, and refine criteria for selection, professional development, performance evaluation, yada, yada, yada. You can read it yourselves. So what's important here is the mutuality of this clinical educator back and forth, that together you've determined who will be supervising and who will be guiding your candidates when they're in their field in clinical experiences, and that those people who are guiding and evaluating your candidates themselves have already demonstrated that they have a positive impact on student learning. And of course that makes sense. But the nuance here is that over time you can also say that these clinical educators, whether they're university-based supervisors or school-based, also have a positive impact on your candidate's development. And as you'll see when the evidence, when we go to the evidence list, that CAEP is really looking for that. So basically what you're trying to do is say, okay, what evidence can I bring to bear that would demonstrate that I have highly effective clinical educators that are engaged with my candidates? Okay. So what are some components? What are some possible evidences that you could submit for this component 2.2? So new, I have said before, criteria for management and evaluations of clinical faculty is a piece of it, but performance evaluations are shared. And I know this is going to be kind of a difficulty for universities because there is a privacy issue involved, both for teachers and for adjuncts or university supervisors. And so you're going to have to think through, how can we do this? And perhaps there's a way for not sharing people's names as individuals, but talking about them as a group. I'm trying to think through this as a former dean and faculty member, sort of how we would get around that. I supervised student teachers in the field while I was a dean, so you've got to be careful about the privacy issues here, but you also need to think about the importance of understanding that the people that are being recommended to you as possible clinical educators in the schools have high quality, have been shown to be highly effective teachers themselves. And so perhaps it's not so much as calling out individuals, but having a principal say, I think these people would be good clinical educators because they've had a good, strong, positive impact on student learning, and I'm very impressed with them. Okay? And for those that maybe participated as clinical educators but have been shown, or I don't know if you do candidate evaluations of clinical educators, but in the universities where I have been, that was always a part of our practice, is to ask candidates for their feedback on their mentors or their cooperating teachers. And if there's a record, there can be personality clashes, and so you want to look at these over time. But if there are records of persistent, if you have at least 3 consecutive reports that this person has not been the best person, then perhaps you need to talk to your partners about counseling them out of their clinical educator roles. The next piece is about clinical educator training and coaching. And the new piece is that CAEP is coming out with language that says both in person and online. And so perhaps you get your clinical educators together to review the handbook and talk about mutual expectations and review the forms they have to fill out once a year, or maybe twice a year before the fall placements or before the spring placements, or perhaps this is something that you can put online. And that completion of a training module, for example, on candidate evaluations and mutual expectations, etc., can be done online. They want to see also possible source of evidence might be that there was joint curriculum, professional development, design, and redesign. As you know, part of this component is that your partners and the EPP are engaged in providing support to the clinical educators, and this could be in the form of professional development, and if so, that they've been engaged in that professional development as well. And lastly, it talks about surveys of clinical educators and candidates of the quality and consistency of the candidates as well as the placements, and that you use this data. And throughout the CAEP standards, you'll find heavy emphasis on the use of data for modifying or improving programs, for improving courses, for improving the unit operations. And this is an example of improving unit operations in modification of clinical experiences based on the surveys that have gone out there. Okay, so other evidence for 2.2 are documentation that these high-quality clinical educators are co-selected, prepared, evaluated, supported, and retained. And you see a list here. What's the criteria for selection of clinical educators? Can you provide documentation that you've together with your partners constructed criteria or content of preparation and training, and that you support your clinical educators? Is there a documentation of collaboratively constructed evaluation of clinical educators so that the candidates, when they're filling out surveys, this isn't something that they do to clinical educators, but rather that your partners have been involved in those elements of evaluation? And last of all, that there's documentation of retention of clinical educators. It is true that in practice, people can be student teacher supervisors or clinical cooperating teachers or mentor teachers for a period of time, and then they need a break. So the documentation of retention is not that this is a yearly cycle, that, it's sort of the revolving door of urban education where there's new people coming in all the time, is not something that we're looking to achieve, because then you're constantly retraining, re-preparing, redeveloping, re-supporting, but rather that your clinical educators do stay in the roles of clinical educators for a period of time. And as I hate to mention the word, but NCTQ pointed out, there are folks who would be awesome, are terrific teachers, but not necessarily great mentors or cooperating teachers. And so this is an opportunity to really identify those people who have strengths in mentoring and who you've trained to mentor and who resonate with that role and who stay in that role for a period of time. Okay. This is the last slide on evidence for 2.2, then we'll talk about AFIs. They're going to want to see that data are collected and that they're used by the EPPs and the P12 educators to refine the criteria for selection of clinical educators. So you're using those surveys, you're sharing those surveys, and you're discussing those surveys with your P12 partners to talk about, is there something else we need to include here in how we're selecting our clinical educators, both in the schools and at the university. It says here, this next one is a new one. It's a new piece of information, is that resources are available online to ensure access for, I should have said for all clinical educators. Okay, you want clinical educators to be available to have resources online so that, your cooperating teachers or your mentors have an awful lot on their plates, and including your supervisors. And so you want to have resources online so they can really review those forms, review the expectations, know what it is when they go in to observe a candidate, what the target is for that particular evaluation. And then the last bullet here is that they're receiving professional development in the use of these instruments, perhaps professional disposition evaluation, and goals and objectives. Let me mute. Okay, I'm going to unmute. If my doorbell rings again, the dog is going to bark and I will mute. My apologies. No one ever rings my doorbell, particularly at this time of night. So again, just like component 2.1, you have CAEP site visitors. They're going to look for stuff that's particular to 2.2. Okay? If you've got minutes from a meeting, notice here that the minutes are talking about clinical faculty openings, position descriptions, search committees for field supervisors, et cetera, et cetera. These are the minutes particular to the selection of clinical educators. Okay. Next slide. Area for improvement. A heavy-duty stipulation is apparently not something that component 2.2 might lead to, but it could lead to an area for improvement if the reviewers find that your partnerships aren't really engaged in co-selecting, preparing, evaluating, supporting, and retaining faculty. And it should say clinical faculty, okay? So just know that if you can't provide evidence of the mutuality of benefit that would derive from co-constructing the criteria, the support, and the retention of clinical educators, that could lead to an area for improvement. All right, the next one is a question and feedback pause. I'm going to unmute everybody. Yep, whoever it is that was at my door went away. And there we go. Anybody? Comments, questions? Happy hour? Okay, I'm going to mute you all again. I'm not hearing any voices, but let me check on my chat room to see if there's any other questions that have come up. Nope. No other questions. Okay, folks. You got to give me something here. And maybe this next one is the place where I could get some feedback from you. Component 2.3. And I just want to do a time check. We're at 5:40, more or less. We'll have about 10 minutes on component 2.3, and then we'll go into wrapping it up by talking about the standard as a whole, how to make your case, and how the standard could be unmet. So in component 2.3, this is all about the clinical experience, the clinical practice itself. And the tricky language in here, and I do say it's tricky and we recognize that, is the sufficient depth, breadth, diversity, coherence, and duration. That's raised a lot of questions, and you will see as we get into this component that I've called out that particular part of the standard to talk about what CAEP is thinking at this time. What you want to be able to ensure is that candidates can demonstrate their developing effectiveness. Remember, I said that was going to appear again and again, that there's a developmental sequence in which the skills and proficiencies needed for effective beginning teaching practice is developed. And this right here, that there's a positive impact on all students' learning and development, and that is called out by CAEP specifically, and we'll talk about that. They expect to see multiple performance-based assessments, performance-based, not just GPAs here, people. They're going to look to see that there are assessments that are performance-based. Are your candidates demonstrating that they have the skills that you're looking to develop, and that those are key points within your programs? So overall, given all this language in component 2.3, what evidence do you have that clinical experiences in fact develop candidates' knowledge, skills, and dispositions, KSD, so that they have a positive impact on P12 learning? That's what CAEP is looking for. So what are some of the possible types of evidence here? Evidence documents that all candidates have active clinical experiences in diverse settings. Don't miss this diverse settings piece here. It didn't go away. It's there. And so you should be keeping track of your field placements and clinical practices to assure that all candidates have been in a couple of different places by the time they get to their culminating student teaching or clinical residency, whatever. That the description of clinical experience goals and design document that clinical experiences are implemented as described. So if you've got a field experience handbook, you could excerpt the portion that talks about the sequential nature of field experiences for initial teacher preparation. And what your reviewers are going to be wanting to do is to find out, either through interviews or visits, that in fact the expectations that you've outlined at each stage of field experience leading to clinical practice has in fact been implemented as you described it. Another possible source of evidence here is a scope and matrix sequence. I can't talk anymore. Sequence matrix that charts the depth, breadth, and diversity. So how many weeks, how many days, how many hours, what are they expected to do? Perhaps they start with observations, they move to small group work, they culminate in taking over a whole class. It's important that these experiences are deliberate, that they're purposeful, they're sequential, and that they are assessed using performance-based protocols, and that this evidence documents the relationship between clinical experiences and coursework. So again, you're looking to see that the depth and the breadth and the diversity of clinical experiences is deliberate, that you're asking candidates to go out there and do specific things for a specific goal or purpose, that it builds their skill development over time, and that you're looking at how those skills are developed over time by using performance-based tools or protocols. Now I'm going to spend some time here talking about these attributes, and I'm going to go into a new slide about the possible research opportunities here. But the attributes of depth, breadth, diversity, coherence, and duration should be linked to student outcomes. So this is new from CAEP, right here in the middle, that candidate and completed performance is assessed in more than one clinical experiences. If you've still got a model by which or in which candidates don't go out into the field until the very end of all their academic coursework, that's going to be problematic for you coming up to meet the CAEP standard here in component 2.3. But this is speaking specifically to what candidates do during their clinical and field experiences, and that is that their performance and impact is assessed, that candidates is assessed in terms of their use of both formative and summative assessments with their students, that they are assessed on their ability to use that data to measure their impact on student learning and to guide their instructional decision making, that they differentiate instruction based on these formative and summative assessments. And if you think back to Standard 1, Component 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.4, this is where you've already provided information about your candidates' information and data on your candidates' abilities to use assessment data to address learners and learning, to differentiate instruction. And so all of that can be cross-tagged to this particular component 2.3. So it may not need necessarily new sources of evidence as much as it needs cross-tagging of the evidence you've already provided under Standard 1 to discuss as part of meeting Standard 2. Okay, so it's also saying here, and again, this is new, and it's in the new accreditation handbook, the candidates have purposely assessed their own impact on student learning using 2 comparison points. So I kind of went off on the sidetrack that reiterates here. To summarize outcomes, and what you'll be doing is summarizing your outcomes when you talk about Standard 2, is you can cross-reference your evidence and your conclusions from Standard 1, Component 1.1, which talked about exiting completer competencies. In Component 1.1, it talked about exit completer competencies in the learner and learning, content knowledge, instructional practice, and professional responsibilities. All of those can be re-tagged to Component 2.3 and then discussed as meeting the standard that your clinical experiences demonstrate that candidates develop the knowledge and skills that they need and that they have a positive impact on student learning. You can also cross-reference the component 3.4 from Standard 3, which talks about that your programs are selective of candidates throughout their programs, which is evidence of monitoring candidate development during preparation. And last, in Standard 4, you can also backmap from completer impact on P12 learning. And remember, these are your graduates. These are folks that are out in the field for Standard 4. And if you've provided evidence that your completers have a positive impact on candidate learning in Standard 4.1, then you can also link that to Component 2.3 and make the case that the depth and breadth and coherence and diversity of your clinical experiences prepared your candidates to have this positive impact on student learning once they were in service. Okay, final list, I think, of possible types of evidence. There's this whole technology piece here, and it's mentioned in the component about technology-based applications. Okay, they want to see that technology is used by the candidates as well as the students, and that there are specific criteria for the appropriate use of technology. This may well be something you've addressed in component 1.5, because that is about modeling and applying technology. So just cross-reference it here into component 2.3 so that you can talk about the ways that your candidates are implementing and modeling the use of technology for their own learning and for their students' learning. And then again, it's reiterating here that clinical experiences are being assessed using performance-based criteria, that your candidates are assessed and monitored throughout the program. This is component 3.4 in Standard 3, that clinical experiences are assessed using performance-based criteria, that your evidence documents there's a sequence that's focused and purposeful. And we visited that particular phrase again and again. So here's the issue with this idea of depth, breadth, diversity, coherence, and duration. There have been a lot of questions about that. How do we show that? And some of CAEP's response has been to say, oh, you should do research on it. You should select one of the facets of preparation to examine your current placements and then test whether that specific facet systematically, test it systematically to gather data on what works in relation to outcomes. So it's asking for a research-based examination of your own clinical practices, and does it result in the kind of outcomes that you hope for in your candidates? And as you see in the second statement, both of these are coming out of the CAEP accreditation manual. the new one that will be released in March. Okay, it's coming soon. CAEP is really encouraging this kind of research that connects clinical placements and clinical experiences to outcomes that can inform the field. So those of you that perhaps have that kind of research underway, perhaps there's a faculty member that's particularly interested in this, and perhaps it's something that you could propose as your selected improvement initiative or a transformation initiative. In any case, this is an aspect of responding to this particular component that could do double and triple duty across the standards, and that could really help us to inform the field. And I say us in terms of educators, faculty. Okay. So again, here's the sufficiency of clinical experiences. They're the attributes: depth, breadth, diversity, coherence. None of these are defined by CAEP. There were a lot of calls for the CAEP Commission Committee on Standard 2 to identify a number of clinical hours that were required, and yet CAEP felt very strongly that this was a function of the states, that this was not their purview. To say how many clinical hours or pre-student teaching hours are required, that's a state's right. And so what CAEP settled on, or what the CAEP committee settled on, was talking about these attributes. Is your clinical experience deep enough, broad enough, diverse enough, coherent enough, and long enough to really prepare your candidates to be effective beginning teachers? So the note here, straight out of the new version of the Accreditation Handbook, CAEP gives EPPs the responsibility to justify their choices for these attributes. What you got to do is ensure that your candidates are effective and have a positive impact on all students, and that your clinical experiences prepare them to do that. So what are the AFIs or stipulations? We've got about 7 minutes left and we're almost done. An area for improvement could be assigned here if you don't provide evidence that clinical experiences allow opportunities for partners and candidates to employ instructions, uses of technology. There's a typo here. So clearly, if you're not showing that your clinical experiences are allowing opportunities for your candidates to use technology, they could assign an area for improvement. If there's no documentation that clinical experiences engage diverse P12 students, all students is in the standard, it's also applicable to the cross-cutting diversity theme. And up here, it's also applicable to the cross-cutting technology theme if your candidates are not employing technology in their instruction. Okay? There could be a stipulation here. There could be a really strong area for improvement, a stipulation that says if there's no evidence from pre-service measures that your candidates have a positive impact on P12 student learning and development, you could get a stipulation. And that means you got to fix that within a couple of years. Okay, I'm going to pause very, very briefly here because we're running out of time, and I'm going to unmute everybody. Hello, hello. There's a party going on. I hear it. Any other questions come up in the chat room? Yes. Another question. Good. Let's go down there. Therefore, let me mute folks again. Therefore, the expectations and assessments between and among initial experiences, middle practica, and student teaching are all aligned in a developmental sequence demonstrating an impact on student learning. Is that accurate? That is completely accurate. Well said. Hear, hear. That's exactly right. So yeah, if your faculty haven't sat down, talked about, well, here's what I do in my class, and I ask them to observe, and then somebody else says, well, I asked them to observe, and somebody else says, well, yeah, I asked them to observe as well, Maybe there should be some kind of a curriculum mapping going on where you're really fine-tuning that so that they're not doing the same thing again and again in every single course, but that there is a developmental sequence identified and that it's purposeful and that it's being assessed. So, well said. Okay, I'm going to unmute you. Anybody else? Okay, you're muted again. We're going to forge on. And by forging on, I mean we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about the key points of the language. Remember, what you're trying, when you get to talk, when you get to prepare your narrative, you're not talking component by component. You're not saying, well, here's what I say about component 2.1. Here's what I say about component 2.2. No, you're doing a holistic statement that says, look, I know we have effective partnerships and high quality clinical practice. Or I know we have problems in effective partnering, and here's what we need to do. And here's the plan that we have provided. Here's the plan that we're setting forth in order to improve our partnerships. Or, you know, we've got some issues perhaps with high quality clinical practice because our evidence shows blah, blah, or blah, blah. And we have seen that we have not really engaged our partners in determining the selection of clinical educators in the way we'd like, and so that's where we're going to spend some time and attention, and here's how we're going to do that. Remember, if there's always something that you identify that, you know, you don't have to be perfect, but if you identify something that needs help, then call it out and provide a plan for how you're going to address it. Okay, so this is what you're doing. General rules for standard 2. You've got to have 3 cycles of data. We've talked about this before. If you haven't been a part of the webinars that discussed it, 3 cycles of data may mean 3 years if you only do it once a year. For example, state licensure exams. You get your aggregated data from that, Title II data, once a year. Okay, so you're going to need 3 years of that. But if you do student teaching observations in the fall and in the spring, you only need 3 cycles. That means fall, spring, fall. Okay, so 3 cycles of data. This is an important piece. It had not been stated by CAEP previously. This appears in the new accreditation handbook. If a revised assessment is submitted, and lots of you are working on improving your assessment tools, okay? If you've got less than 3 cycles of data, then you need to also include the data from those original assessments, okay? So your cycles of data must be sequential. You can't skip years or skip semesters if you use it every semester. You've got to provide 3 sequential cycles, and they've got to be the latest available. So if you've got data that looks a lot better if you aggregate it from 11, 12, and 13, sorry. If your self-study report is going in 2017, then you've got to include data from 2016, 2015, 2014, or from the latest available. Whether if your report's going in spring 2017, then it should be fall 17, if it's going in spring 2017, it should be fall 16, spring 15, fall 15. You get the picture. EPP created assessments must be rated at the level of sufficient. We have talked about this before. I'm going to pull up the tool. This is a new one that's available on the CAEP website. This is the sufficient level. And this is the tool they're going to use for EPP created assessments used in accreditation. So if you're uncertain about whether or not your EPP assessments are at the sufficient level, go to the CAEP website, download this new assessment tool, and take a real good peek at the sufficient level, because this is what you're going to be held accountable to. CAEP's feeling is, if those assessment tools aren't at least sufficient, then how can we really rely on the data that comes from assessment tools that aren't sufficient? So take a real good peek, because if your tools aren't at that level, then you may have a problem. And you need to address all the components. By addressing a component means you need to upload evidence into each component bucket. 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. There are no components in Standard 2 that must be met And so here's the distinction there. You have to address the component, but you don't need to fully meet the component. So say you're not so solid in terms of your clinical educator processes. That'll be, you may get an AFI there, but you don't must meet it. There isn't that requirement. There is a requirement, as you know, in Standard 3 that you must meet Component 3.2. There is a requirement in Standard 5 that you must meet Components 5.3 and 5.4. And you must meet all components of Standard 4. So that's the distinction between the must meets versus the must address. So you can address all the components of Standard 2, but there are no, you must meet the component in order to meet the standard. Making the case for Standard 2, it's all about putting the data in context, providing information from multiple sources, analyzing and interpreting those. And here is really important, CAEP is underscoring this in the new accreditation handbook, that your interpretations are appropriate and your conclusions are warranted. So go back to your old doctoral dissertation days and remember that, you know, sort of making more out of the data you have on hand than is warranted, not a good practice. That you're calling out any differences or similarities across licensure areas, comparisons over time, any demographical data that you've examined, trends or patterns, that you've got to be analyzing this data, you've got to be interpreting the data that you put forward, and that you have considered the implications of the findings. And this is a new piece here. There's evidence that you and your partners have considered the implications of any findings that you have. Areas for improvement or stipulations on the standard as a whole. Again, if your EPP created assessments are judged with significant deficiencies, I'm going to pop it up again here. If you're not at least in the sufficient area when it comes to your EPP created instruments, chances are you're going to get an area for improvement there. If there are inaccuracies in reporting the data from original sources, one of the things that CAEP reviewers are being trained to do is to do data audits. Okay, is to dig into your raw data and see if they come to the same conclusions that you did in your report. So if the review team is finding that there are some inaccuracies in reporting your data, then you could be called out with an area for improvement. If you haven't really analyzed your evidence, and that's what I was underscoring a minute ago, and what it says, that's going to be problematic for Standard 2, and you could get an area for improvement. All your evidence could be in place, but if you haven't done a really good analysis of that evidence and interpreted it and made some plans based on it, then chances are you're going to get an area for improvement. A stipulation. This one, interpretations are not well grounded in the evidence. This is what we just talked about. I said, remember your dissertation days. A stipulation could be assigned if you don't have any evidence that you've looked at the evidence for improvement purposes, or that you have absolutely not made any effort to ensure the validity of your evidence. You could get a stipulation there. So what? So what does a stipulation lead to? Well, here you go. If you look at the last bullet, if there are 2 or more stipulations from among 2 or more, let's say you get 1 in 2.1 because there isn't sufficient evidence that your partnerships actually do what you say they do. And then you just got a new one because you never really considered the validity of your evidence. If you've got 2 or more stipulations, the chances are you could get an unmet standard. If you fail to demonstrate that any aspect of your clinical experience is sufficient, okay, it's enough to ensure that your candidates are effective beginning teachers, you fail to demonstrate that across this entire standard, it could be found unmet. And I know I'm working from the bottom up here, but last, if you fail to document or provide the case that you are maintaining functional partnerships with districts or schools for clinical practice, you're going to get Standard 2 unmet. Or chances are. Okay, you might get that. Chances are good. that you will get that if you can't demonstrate that you have functioning partnerships with schools. Okay, final feedback and question pause. It's actually 6:05. I'm moving forward. You're going to get a feedback survey by March 4th. First, there are webinars in March, April, and May. Here they are. There's the login information. And I strongly encourage you to offer yourselves up to CAEP to become assessment reviewers or to become site visitors. The nomination process is available on the CAEP website. There's a link to it, the call to service, and that closes on March 18th. So definitely consider signing up to become a reviewer. It will definitely help you as you look at what other people are doing, and you can take all of that back to your own sites. So let me see if there's another question. There is a wonderful thank you note from someone, and thank you for sending me a thank you note. Often when I do these presentations, it feels like I'm talking to myself if I don't get any questions and if nobody speaks up. So I'm unmuting you all. Any final questions? Comments? Ha! Okay. Well, I don't have anything showing and no more slides, so everybody, you'll get a feedback survey in a couple days. If you did not provide the, if you didn't log in and provide an email address, then you won't get that survey. And if I have any other updates, I will definitely share them with you. I know that Stevie Chepko is going to be presenting on Standard 2 at the CAEP conference in spring. And she has developed a couple of tables that may be included as templates for Standard 2, but apparently those will not go into effect until 2018. And the tables are basically scope and sequence or matrix alignment charts that show what kinds of field experiences, sequence of field experiences you have and how those are assessed. So Stevie's PowerPoint will be available in March when the CAEP conference goes live, and you're welcome to go in there and download that, and they will also include those charts, etc., in an announcement after March if those are approved. So in the meantime, thank you everyone. I'm going to stop recording this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. I do see another question. Thank you. You made me laugh. We're out here listening to you. Thank you. Okay, folks, stopping the webinar now, stopping recording, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye-bye.